afternoon. Thank you for coming to Concord Bookshop on such a chilly day. Today you're getting two for the price of one. We have with us Kate Flora and her co-editor Ruth McCarty. They have co-edited, along with another writer who could not be here today, a fiction anthology called Seasmoke. It's actually a crime story anthology, and they focus on stories by New England writers. And so they will both be at least discussing their stories, if not reading from them today. In addition, Kate will also be discussing her latest full-length novel. It's her latest Joe Burgess mystery. It's called Playing God. And I would just want you to know that Kate is the author of numerous mysteries. She teaches writing classes and workshops. She's also been the president of the International Mystery Writers Association called Sisters in Crime, which I believe they both were on the cover of this year. They have a calendar that they were on the cover of. And we're very happy to have her and her friend with her, so please help me welcome Kate Flora and Ruth McCarty.
Well, thank you for coming out. At least it's not snowing. I think that for the first 6 books that I had in my Thea Kozak series, I had a snowstorm every single time I scheduled an event, and eventually I realized that I should probably be a weather woman and not a writer because I could make it snow. But so far we've had pretty good luck with Finding Amy, which came out in May, and it didn't snow in May, so perhaps my luck has turned. And Playing God came out in September, and once again, as you remember, we had a beautiful fall. It did not snow. So clearly I needed to just shift my emphasis from writing either amateur detectives to professional detectives, or I needed to get my books published in a different season of the year. But we have something of a schizophrenic presentation today, and that's because when I first set this up and talked to John and I were talking about how much John Netzer loves short stories and how interested he was in the fact that I was partner in a group which does crime story anthologies. And this is our newest one, Seasmoke. And Ruth has our last one, Windchill. And what happened was that there was this strange period in my exciting and successful professional life when I couldn't sell a book on a street corner. And so for 3 years, despite the fact that I wrote assiduously, I couldn't sell a book. And since I couldn't sell a book, something wonderful happened, and that is that I decided I could either give up writing and fall into the slough of despond, or I could say what I am as a writer and what I now can do because I don't have deadlines is take chances. And the decision to take chances led me in all of these really exciting directions. It meant that I said, okay, I don't have a deadline for my Thea Kozak series. I can write the police procedural, which I've been thinking about writing for a long time, which set me on the very interesting course of going to Portland, Maine, to do research for Playing God, which is a very different kind of a book from my Thea Kozak mysteries. It's a hard-boiled police detective novel. And while I was doing research for Playing God, I met Joe Laughlin, who was then head of CID in the Portland Police Department. And Joe started telling me the story of the Amy St. Laurent investigation, which led me on a 2.5-year detour into writing a true crime called Finding Amy, which is the real story of a murder investigation. And while I was in the process of doing that, and because I, again, was in the let's take chances mode, a friend of ours, a woman named Susan Alexi, who is the bravest woman I know, called up and said, I want to do crime story anthologies and I need someone to be a co-editor. Would you be interested? And I said, sure, because I was very into saying yes to things at that point instead of no, I can't, or I'm too busy. So I ended up becoming one of the partners in Level Best Books. We did a crime story anthology, which we thought would be a one-off, and it turned out that we were so interested in crime writing in the short story form that we decided to do another one. And then our third editor, Sky Alexander, decided to move to Texas so she could no longer be the editor of a New England anthology. And so we called up Ruth, another chance taker, and said, would you be interested in joining us as a third editor? And Ruth?
Well, up to that point, I've only written short stories, so this was really something different for me. To be on the other side of the table, so to speak, reading stories from people that I knew and having to send rejections to some people, that was a very hard thing to do. But I found that most of the stories were wonderful, and we really had, if we had more space, we would have chosen a lot more of them too. But, you know, the book can only be so wide. But I've had a great time on the other side of the fence.
And you're not just the editor for this collection. You also are an editor for, what, New England Writers Network?
Yes, it's a magazine, and it's different because it takes your stories and then it has a thing that says why we chose to publish, so that new writers reading the stories and reading why we chose the story can help improve their writing.
So at this point, I'm going to talk a little bit about playing God, because I don't know if some of you are here because you write fiction, or some of you are here just because it's a nice afternoon and you'd like to be entertained listening to mystery stories, or you know, what brings you. So I thought I'd just talk a little bit about my departure from writing what we in the mystery business call the strong amateur female PI, and then Ruth and I would talk a little bit about the difference between writing the novel-length story and writing the short story, and particularly in the crime genre, because that's an interesting thing to be doing. So what happened with me in Playing God is that when I started writing mysteries, and I started writing mysteries when I wrote my first mystery when my second son was born, and he's now 23, so I can always tell exactly how long I've been doing this. And I spent 10 years in the unpublished writer's corner before I finally sold my first mystery. And when I wrote mysteries, I came to it as a lawyer curious about good and evil. And I also came to it as a sort of a late 60s, early 70s feminist who believed, you know, I went to law school because they told me I couldn't. And the kind of protagonist that I wanted to create was the kind of woman who saved herself. I wanted to write, you know, not the sort of, you know, woman who gets herself into a terrible mess and pickle, and then the handsome guy jumps out of the closet and saves her and they ride off into the sunset. I wanted to write books where women actually used their own intelligence and wit and skills to save themselves and to solve crimes. And we all in the mystery business talk about how we come from the Nancy Drew generation. You know, I mean, Ned was useful, but basically he didn't rescue Nancy very often. So that's how I started, and I created a character who at that point was in opposition to everything that I was reading in a lot of people's books. She had a mother who wanted her to find a suitable man, get married, and provide grandchildren, and didn't think that her cop boyfriend was the suitable guy. And she had a very demanding job where she had a boss and clients who had to be pleased and a difficult schedule. And she still had to figure out how to get the clothes to the cleaners and buy groceries, which no guy in a mystery novel at that point ever seemed to do except Spencer, and he was always whipping up the little thing. But for the most part, you know, guys didn't cook, the guys didn't have mothers, guys didn't seem to even have jobs, even if they had jobs. So I decided I'd give her everything that women of my generation were dealing with. And in the course of that, I thought, when I first started, that what a writer does is she sits in a room and makes it up. And what I realized was that particularly when you're writing for the crime reading audience, it's a very sophisticated audience, and if you make it up, they're going to say, we know you made it up because you didn't get it right. And the next thing I knew, I was doing all sorts of things. I was wandering into the Concord Police Department and asking Len Weatherby questions. Carl Johnson, the police chief before Len, used to read my books and say, you know, you've got to make your prose more non-sexist, and he would circle all the things that I did wrong. And I would go up there and I'd say, Len, show and tell, I need to see what a bulletproof vest looks like, or whatever it was. And I ended up doing things like I took a Citizens Police Academy in Waltham, did a ride-along, a bunch of them in various cities. I took the RAD class in self-defense. And I found myself more and more, you know, sort of sitting with police officers and listening to their stories and thinking, I really need to, I really, you know, I have much more respect for their reality, their side of the table now than I ever did before. And I started thinking I'd like to write this police procedural. So when I decided I would finally write one, I went to Portland because I'm from Maine, and I wanted to set my book in Portland. I thought Portland was a nifty city, a city that has the feeling of a small town. It was accessible, but it was also had a huge variety of types of people. so that it would have crime. It had credible crime. Whereas if you killed someone off in Concord every other day, who believed that? We don't have murder in Concord.
It'd be the Jessica
It'd be the
Fletcher
Jessica,
syn-
yeah, exactly.
syndrome.
And we talk about the Cabot Cove syndrome all the time in the mystery world. So I went to the Portland Police Department and got my tour and got my and the day that I went, a guy named Joe Laughlin, who was the CID lieutenant at that point, sort of came bouncing out of his office and smiled at me and said, "You're a writer. I've always wanted to write." And since writers are always looking for great sources, Joe became my source. Joe became my go-to guy. And we all have these people. We all have all kinds of people. You know, we find the person who has the cousin who's a police detective or, you know, the state trooper or whatever, because we need to know all of this stuff that we didn't, you know, as nice suburban housewives need to
It
know.
has to sound right.
Because it has to sound right. So I met Joe, and the first thing Joe said is, "I've always wanted to write." So he became my expert, and I became his writing advisor. And I would read his editorials when he wrote them, and you know, we would talk about various things. I made him sign up for my writing classes when I would teach in Maine, and he would come, and he was a terrific writer. And then this murder happened, and Joe said, "I want to write about this someday." And I got sidetracked for years doing research for Finding Amy, which meant writing the story of a real murder, knowing that all the real people were going to be reading it.
And I think I should tell them that Kate and Joe have been nominated for an Edgar Award, which is the highest mystery award. And I think that's a great thing.
It's very exciting. Yeah, I had to go to Perceptions and buy a dress, so now I have to sell a lot more books. Anyway, so I took my detour, and then I was able to come back and finish Playing God, which is a book that I had wanted to write for a long time. I've been carrying the story in my mind, and the story actually was born at breakfast in Philadelphia when I was having breakfast with a police officer, a police lieutenant, I think he was then, from Newark, Delaware. And he was telling me this story that really happened in their town, where this young pair of college students she had gotten pregnant, they had gone back to college, they decided that when the baby was born, they would kill it. And they met in Newark, Delaware, and they killed the baby, and they put it in a dumpster, and they both went back to college. And he was telling me the story of the detective who investigated the case, who ended up getting so intensely involved in this case, so sort of touched, and you know, police officers are not supposed to be touched by stories. They're supposed to be objectively distant. That's their job, because they can't care about all the things, can't care personally and emotionally about all the things that they see, because then they couldn't do their jobs. So in this case, the detective, because it was a baby, got very wrapped up in the case. And when the case was plea bargained down to nothing, he had a heart attack and had to retire from police work at the age of 38. And I thought about what about the character who has lived a life where, you know, he has been forced to deal over and over and over with really terrible things. And some of those terrible things, despite his attempt at objective distance, have gotten to him. What if there's a guy with just a sort of a torn and tattered soul who still believes in goodness and justice and wants to go solve cases? I want him to be my hero, and I want the case that he's going to be working on to be a case which challenges his objectivity and his person, his whole belief system, so that he ends up in Playing God being asked to work as the detective on a case where the victim is somebody he would not have been unhappy to see dead. And so that presents, you know, a tremendous moral dilemma for him between the person and the cop. And so that became my story for Playing God. Yesterday I finished The Angel of Knowlton Park, which is the second Joe Burgess mystery. So I'm very, very wrapped up in Joe Burgess right now. My head is completely full of Joe Burgess stories and, you know, what he looks like and how he acts and stuff. So that's my Playing God story. Short stories are a completely different thing. You know, I have spent the last 20 years writing somewhere between stories that take between 350 and 400 pages. They take me a year and a half to research and write. They completely occupy your mind when you're writing them. And I thought when I was asked to be an editor that I was going to learn an enormous amount about writing the short story. You know, what's different? how does a short story writer approach story? What are the elements of a short story that are different? And I think actually Ruth, because she edits for 2 different publications, has more to say about this than I do. But what is the difference between a novel and a crime story?
Well, I think when you're writing the short story, you have to get right into the action, and you have to cut everything out that isn't important to the story. You don't have time to fill in a lot of detail about the weather or climate. You want to just grab the reader right away. You want to keep their attention and keep them going till you have a twist ending. I've been working on a novel, and it's about a woman whose daughter had been kidnapped, and now she is trying to find other kids who have been kidnapped because they could never find her daughter. And there's so much more that has to go into writing the novel. There's lots of different subplots, different lines that you have to tie up, where a short story, you just get to it and just write it right out.
Can I add anything to that? Well, I think one of the most wonderful things about this, and the hardest, as Ruth said, is rejecting your friends, is rejecting a story that's almost good enough, or is rejecting a story that's good enough but there's not quite enough crime in it, or you're saying to the author, this story's good, it's a perfectly good story, but it's not interesting, it's not unusual enough, it's not unique enough, it doesn't have that spark which is going to linger in the reader's mind when they close the book and put it down, or it's a subject that's been done too much and you haven't got a fresh take on it. So one of the things that turns out to hook us, which I was really surprised about in learning to do this, is voice. For me, I think that does the story have a voice? Does the character in the story have a voice? Which when you pick it up, you immediately are attracted to, intrigued by, captivated by that voice, that story. Is there something about the writing that's more stylish or stronger or more vivid or something like that, which sort of pulls you into it and keeps you there writing? And for me, I think some people, Susan, who's not here, and I'm sorry she's not, I think is more into the shape of a story. I'm very much more into the atmosphere, the voice, the mood of a story. I want a story that when the book is done, something will linger in your mind. The emotion, the thing that happened, the effect of the story. So for me, that's a really challenging thing. Is how do you pick, if you've got 80 or 100 stories to choose from? How do you pick a collection which will have some texture? How will you pick something that's going to be interesting? And these are, interestingly enough, crime stories. In a crime novel, it almost always needs to have a murder. That's what we expect, that's what the reader expects. But when you're looking at a crime story, it can be a caper, it can be a scam. And then those two are really entertaining stories. They're really fun to read. This is the kind of book you take on an airplane. Enough time to read the 12 or 15 or short stories are wonderful, and I read a lot more of them. I probably read a lot more short stories too, because John is often standing near the desk when I walk through the Concord Bookshop, and he says, "Have you read the new collection of short stories by?" And off I go. And I keep thinking, wouldn't it be wonderful to be able to write like this person, or wouldn't it be wonderful to be able to write like that person? And being the editor, I have, Ruth and I get to pick stories by people that we can say, isn't it wonderful to be the publisher who gets to put this person in print for the first time and to publish this wonderful story, to be the sort of midwives to a career, or to new writers. So there's all these really exciting things that happen.
And there are very few markets for short stories, especially mystery short stories. There's Alfred Hitchcock Mystery Magazine and Ellery Queen Magazine, but to get into there, you have to almost be a well-known name, although they do have some new people.
They pick some new people, but it's the market is very small, and so it's also exciting to be able to create a market, to be able to create a place where publishing opportunities are created in a shrinking world for new writers. And we publish. Our requirement is that we publish only from the 6 New England states. And what we have learned is that there are a lot of people out there who are ageographical, and we're constantly getting letters from people in New York who say, New York is right next to New England, do I count? Or my favorite one was from the Netherlands who said, well, I lived in New England once. So
Or I honeymooned there.
I honeymooned there,
count?
right? I took a trip to Maine once. Does that make me a New England writer? But we were looking for something different. We were looking for, from the crime writer's perspective, a glimpse inside the New England writer's mind. Is there something particular about our culture, our character, our geography, which influences writing? And so it's been really interesting to see there often is a dark, almost Hawthornian supernatural theme which runs through some of our stories. There's a lot of stories that sort of play off on that whole, is it Sherlock Holmes who was the one who said that there was nothing more terrifying than the idea of being alone in the farmhouse in the country where no one would hear your scream? I mean, we certainly see some of that. We certainly see the hard scrabble side of life. We see the isolation. But we also see the dark, impoverished, gritty New England cities. And so it's it gives us a really interesting texture for the collection.
We probably should mention that we bring the collection out each fall at the New England Crime Bake. And Kate and I are actually charter members, I guess you would call it. Founding members is a better word for it.
Crime Bake.
Yep.
Oh yeah, the Crime Bake. The Crime Bake is something that we're always surprised that not everybody knows about the New England Crime Bake. The New England Crime Bake is Veterans Day weekend each November. And it is a mystery conference. It's New England's own mystery conference. Our symbol is a lobster with handcuffs. And, but the Crime Bake we try each year to provide this sort of combination program of getting a chance to meet a lot of your New England writers. And so far we limit our programming to New England writers because we think that we have a rich bunch of very talented writers here, and we want people to be able to see who they are and what they write. But we also bring in forensics experts, so that we will do something on crime scene, or we will do something on the police officer's life and the equipment and the gun and the vest and the actual what it's like to roll up on a crime scene kind of thing. Last year we had Lucy Zare, the poison lady, who's absolutely wonderful. And we're a very dangerous bunch. Imagine people waxing enthusiastic about how many ways you can poison someone. But the truth is that that's sort of the world that we occupy. But the Crime Bake is really fun. And if you think you might be interested, just let us know, and we'll be sure that you get a brochure, because it's 2 days of fun and murder, and
And we published the Al Blanchard Award. Al Blanchard was a local writer, I'm sure many of you have heard of him, who was also a founding member of the Crime Bake, who suddenly passed away at the conference. And so he always liked to help people. He mentored a lot of people, and we give out an award each year called the Al Blanchard Award, and the winning story is published in Level Best Books.
So each of these anthologies begins with the Al Blanchard award-winning story. Last year was Brendan Du Bois. It was pretty well known, and everybody said, oh, if Brendan wins, then there's no sense in amateur writers bothering to enter the contest. But this year it was a guy who published a short story, once 20 years ago or something, named Jim Shannon, who has the most wonderful story. It's not a murder story, it's a family scam called, what is it? Oh, what's his name? I gotta, because it's
Medeiros?
Roadhouse Medeiros and the Jade Dragon is the name of that story, and it's a wonderful, who's going to inherit the prized family Jade Dragon. It's just completely charming, and it's so much fun to have them run from short to long, and to run from lighthearted and charming to absolutely as dark as they can be. And some collections are darker than others. I like to think that 3 years ago we were all having a very dark moment because that collection is black as it can be, and this one's a little lighter, and Seasmoke is much more mixed. So Ruth was going to read. We think it's fun to give you a texture, to sort of read the beginnings of some short stories so you can see what it is that we're putting in those books. She's going to read her own, right?
This is my story from Windchill, and it's called The Saturday Morning Writers Group. And I got the idea from this story when I was asked to join a writers group in Shrewsbury. And I live in Leominster, and it was always on Friday mornings, and it turned out that I couldn't show up there a lot of times. So I came up with this idea and wrote the story. It's very short, only 625 words. The Saturday Morning Writers Group. I hate it when he drinks. Tonight he called me a whore. How could he think that? I've never been unfaithful. Hannah is already reading as I slip into my usual seat at the Saturday Morning Writers Group. We've met at Hannah's for the past 7 years, and I can honestly say that this is the first morning I've arrived late. I say hello, but the group's listening to the story, so they don't respond. We're very serious when it comes to analyzing each other's work, so I'm not surprised when no one answers. My copy of the story is in front of me, and a beautiful long stem red rose lies across it. How sweet. It must be from Hannah's garden. The others have roses too. I lean in and take a deep breath of the heady perfume. Hannah abruptly places the papers on the table. I don't think I can do this. Do what, Hannah? I ask. Laurie speaks at the same time I do. She'd want us to. Who are we talking about? I whisper to Kate. But as I speak, she reaches over and places her hand on Hannah's arm. We owe it to her, Kate says. Hannah reaches for a tissue and blows her nose. Must be the flowers. You're right, she says, then picks up the story and continues. He says I sneak out while he's at work. I remind him that he calls me all day long, at all different times, and I'm always here to answer the phone. He drives me to the grocery store, to the cleaners, to church on Sunday. He pinches my arm when the young boy bagging my groceries says hello. He cuts up my clothes, so I'll never have to clean them again. He says I must be a sinner because I go to church. He says I sneak my lover in. That bastard, Laurie says aloud. Hannah looks up. She looks like she's going to cry, but she continues. I've hidden the bruises, lied about the broken bones. Why the hell didn't she tell us? Kate picks up her rose. She makes a tiny sound as she purposely pricks her finger on a thorn. A lone tear rolls from the corner of her eye. I watch as it drips off her chin onto the paper she's holding. What's gotten into all of you? Why did you do that, Kate? I speak louder so they'll hear me this time. Hannah looks right at me, sighs, then starts to read. I'm afraid of what he might do, so I've locked myself in my office. I should be safe here. Laurie sobs. I feel a tightness in my chest. I hear him coming. He's put a key in the lock. Please, if anything happens to me, please give this email to the police. Hannah slowly gets up. She takes a tray from the counter and places it on the table. Champagne in the morning? Has she sold her story? She pours 4 glasses. Kate and Laurie reach for theirs. They put one in front of me. I can't quite reach mine for some reason. Hannah lifts her glass. Wait, I cry. I can't pick up my glass. Hannah says, a toast to Melissa of the Saturday Morning Writers Group, who never missed a meeting, wherever you are now. I'm here, I cry. I feel like I'm rushing through a tunnel. Something's not right. I feel like I'm fading. I fight it. May you rest in peace, and may that bastard of a husband rot in hell. A burst of light fills me with happiness as I run down the tunnel. Is there a name for that length of fiction? Is that just a short? Flash fiction. Yeah, well, flash fiction can be from 500 to 1,000 words, depending on the editor. And this one was 625.
Wow. You can see why we picked that story. And sometimes there was this, and I don't think we have the book with us. It's the third collection called Riptide. where there was a story that came in, and we all looked at it, and it begins with 3 paragraphs of weather. And I looked at it and said, uh-oh, this is obviously someone who's just finished an MFA program. You don't use 3 paragraphs of weather in short crime fiction because we're looking for economy. But I persevered because it was very well written weather. And by the time I got to the end of the 3rd paragraph, I was hooked, and it turned out to be an absolutely dynamite story, and turned out to be one of those stories where he had just finished his MA in creative writing, and we got to be the publisher of his first story. And so that was just tremendously exciting. It's tremendously exciting to hold a book signing and have your brand new writers come. And there are people who publish for years and write for years and never hold a book in their hand, particularly short story writers. And we actually, get them to have book signings with the book, which is really fun. So I'm going to read just a little bit of my short story in Seasmoke. And having told you a little bit about Finding Amy, which is the story of a real murder, and having sat in the courtroom with the defendant's mother and the victim's mother, you may actually see where the inspiration for this story came from. It's called Worms Crawl In. Rainey first understood that she would one day kill Beryl Monroe's daughter, as the medical examiner described collecting insect larvae from Caitlin's body. The courtroom benches were hard, as was the testimony, and a year of grieving had left her with no padding, emotional or physical, to ease her through it. The details of Caitlin's last moments and death, gleaned from the autopsy of her decomposed body, had run along Rainey's nerves like hot nails. Caitlin was 15 months gone, and Rainey still longed to protect her, to shield her dear daughter's naked, dissected self from the ears of curiosity seekers. She hadn't been able to protect Caitlin then. She couldn't now. Across the aisle, Jason Monroe's mother, looking like a hunched toad in her green dress, clutched her Bible and rocked. Funny how murder trials sorted themselves out like weddings. Sick funny, not funny funny. Friends of the victim, friends of her killer. The Monroe pew was more sparsely settled than hers. Not so many people who wanted to get up close and personal with them, her killer. Rainey knew, how not, watching this carefully scripted charade of a trial that didn't let in any truth about Jason's character, that a person was innocent until proven guilty. But all those months with the detectives, with the gradual accretion of details, daily body blows coming on the heels of sleepless nights, had left her with no reasonable doubt. So that obviously came from sitting in the courtroom watching Amy's mother, who is an absolutely extraordinary and exemplary woman, and Gorman's mother, who sat there and clutched her Bible, and even though her son had confessed to her, said, "I know my son is innocent, I know my son is innocent, they're not giving him a fair shake." So just, sometimes all you have to do to get inspiration for a story is to pick up the newspaper and read it, and it's all right there. So, any questions we could answer for you? We could read to you some more, but we love to answer questions. We're always just curious about what people wonder about. Yeah.
I read a lot of mysteries, and a couple of authors I think I'm going to stop reading. They get into their heroines, what I call the perils of Pauline, every single time. Some writers who get into a rut. You know what? The character, they never change. Nothing changes. And I call the peril because they put him in the situation. I figure, unless they're going to kill him off,
Right.
Anything like that?
I think that it's extremely difficult when you're writing a series.
Yeah, the same
There are sort of a set of choices that writers make. There's what we call the Sue Grafton style, where her character never gets any older, and nothing ever changes, and her life never changes, and her relationships never mature, and she never matures. She's sort of exactly the same, as she was 20 books ago. And so, that's sort of one kind of thing. I think that then there are those people whose characters change and change and change, and then there are the people whose publishers will say, don't change, or I want you to. And we never really know as readers, sort of what's happening. I think that, for example, Julia Spencer Fleming, I think is a terrific author and writes wonderful tension. But the last third of her books always seems to be this dramatic chase, blah, 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 that goes on, and then the thing gets resolved. And on the one hand, I find that irritates me, and on the other hand, I sort of imitated it in my last book because obviously it's working. You know, she's very successful. So, but I think I like to think that it's story driven as well as character driven. That each story that we're writing is an individual story, and you should be able to pick up any one of these books and be satisfied by the completeness of the story. Never mind the character, whose arc is different from the arc of the story. The character has to go on book after book. For those of you who are familiar with Thea, I mean, one of the real challenges I have is that I have this vast pod of readers out there who want Thea and Andre to have a child. And I, as Thea's mother, very much would love to have a grandchild. But there is a terrible problem with the detective who has a small baby who goes off larking and gets herself into dangerous situations. We, as mothers, might not exactly approve of that. So I've written myself into a serious challenge. And I think that, but I also think it's good for us to hear from readers. I get lots and lots of email from people who say, I want to believe that a woman can have a profession and be strong and be independent and still have a marriage and a relationship. And, and that kind of feedback is fascinating. I didn't know when I set out years ago writing that was what was going to be coming back at me. I didn't know that was on people's minds. That readers became so invested in the series character, as and they will drop you. You kill off the significant other, they will drop you. They get annoyed. They have you as readers have expectations.
I went to one mystery conference called BoucherCon, and there was a woman there, an author, I can't remember her name right now, but her character breastfed the baby. Now, how can you get up in the middle of the night to go chase after clues or a villain and bring your baby along? It just didn't seem plausible.
Yeah, I think it works better in the cozy than it does in the medium or the hard-boiled, where there are actual bad guys who are actually bad, as opposed to the suggestion of bad off stage. Another question, yeah.
I'm curious how the police, you said you did ride-alongs and, chatted up policemen and everything. How did they receive your requests initially? I mean, did they say, oh, this is great, someone's writing?
It depends on where you are. It depends on a lot of things. In Concord, we have a very user-friendly police department, and they will say, we are about public service, and so Len Weatherby was very helpful at arranging ride-alongs. I did my Citizens Police Academy in Waltham, which they let me take because Concord doesn't have one, and so they were very sweet about letting me do that. And there again, they felt that public education, that the more the public was informed about what's really going on with the police and their lives and their work and their job, the better the relationship is overall. There are some places that are very impatient. When I did a ride-along in Portland, the first thing that they told me was, the police, I can't remember who told me this, whether it was a cop or whether it was a citizen, said, basically, they don't really want you there. They don't like having you there. Try not to be too big a nuisance. Try not to ask too many questions. Try not to be too annoying. Don't talk a lot. And so, but I found that I think that both of us have found, and Ruth will talk about this too, that if you're genuinely interested and open-minded about what somebody does and ask intelligent questions, they really like to talk to you because they're getting to share the details of their lives and their training with someone who just finds them fascinating. Whereas their wives and their coworkers, it's kind of ho-hum. We've seen it before. We know what you do, or we do it too. So you will meet people who don't want to talk to you. And then, and I always try to come in with an introduction. I always try to approach somebody and, either through their chief or through another police officer. That's why, Joe became such a valuable asset. If I wanted to know about something, I would say to Joe, can you introduce me to someone who will? Which is why writing Finding Amy, I had tremendous access. The state police talked to me. The game wardens answered all my questions, read their sections of the book, vetted the book, and gave it back to me with corrections, and came to our launch party. So, because I think partly, because, you do it politely and you do it carefully, but I've had tremendously good luck.
I've had one police officer that was from my hometown, And he started telling all these different stories, and all of a sudden he realized that I'm from the hometown, and he said, well, you can't repeat this one, and you can't repeat that one. He's letting too much out of the bag, but it was very interesting to hear.
So I think that, and they will tell you what you can repeat and what you can't, and
Since you take so much from the news and from real crimes, do you find you're so particularly tuned into that that you almost can't turn it off? I'm picturing you, driving along, hearing the story about the wacky astronaut, and immediately thinking how that plays out into a story.
to some extent, yes. I mean, we do listen to them. Actually, I see a flip side of that, which is that when I read a story in the news, I say, but they didn't ask this question, and what about that? And I want to, for example, there was a story in the paper today about the girl in Maine who went missing about 3 months ago. And I read the story and I said to my husband, this is so well reported because there were details. All the questions that I read something and I normally would say, yes, but. And then I would say, but did they bring in a handwriting expert to analyze the initials scratched on the bridge? Did they fingerprint the iPod and the cell phone? Did they, do this? And but they had polygraphed the guy at the bar. They had, they had done a lot of the stuff that you would want them to do. They'd done the computer forensics. They'd done the diving search. So, you're actually, now I'm always saying, what's the story? We're always both saying, what's the story behind the story? What do we not know yet? What do we want to know?
Plus, if you do use that story, you totally turn it around so that it's different. My second story in Riptide, called The Intruder. In our area, a young boy had been living in someone's attic and eventually killed the wife and the 2 children. Now, I could never use that story, so I took that story and I twisted it around so that there is an attempted murder. There are chicken bones and different things in the attic as if someone is living there, but then the story is totally different from what really happened.
I mean, I'm trying to remember which story I have in which collections. I don't write short stories. They make me write short stories. So now I'm working really hard on trying to learn to write a short story better. But I was trying to think Oh yeah, the story that's in this collection, which is called Role Model, which is about a lawyer, a personal injuries, a mean personal injuries lawyer. Who dies after eating Chinese food. Actually came from a story that I got at the hairdresser. I was at the hairdresser having my hair cut, and I hate having my hair cut, and she was taking something like this much off my hair. And I was in a state of great trauma, but Susan Conant was there. And Susan Conant entertained me while I was getting my hair cut by telling me stories. And she said, it's really funny how we read in the newspaper and we all think about crime and how a crime happens and we assume that it'll get investigated and all these things happen and nothing ever gets investigated. And she said, that one day she was walking down the street and her next door neighbor was out there lying on his lawn and he wasn't dead, he was unconscious, but she thought, there's an unconscious man lying in the neighborhood and there's no furor, there's nothing going on, no one is even noticing, cars are going by him. So. And then she told me another story about, a lawyer who lived somewhere nearby who, died quite young. And she said, and the police never questioned it for a second. They never, there wasn't an investigation. There wasn't anybody looking into this. And I thought, well, so what if you did look into it? How would you look into it? And, how, and one of the things that we're always thinking about is, how do you make something look real? How do you make it look plausible? In my experience doing research, one of the most amazing things is that I have found doctors who were perfectly willing to tell me how to kill people. And the guys at my car dealer, when I asked them how I could fiddle with a car to make it crash, just sort of folded their arms and said, we're not telling you that. What do you think we are? So, it's very different, but you go around, you ask your questions and try to figure out, what is behind or how can you take the surface story and play with it and what's behind that.
Is that the Law and Order syndrome?
Ripped from the headlines.
What we like to think is that we actually do a better job.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah.
I once was listening to a medical examiner down in Florida who teaches, at the police academy, and he said one of the things that he does is he assigns his students to watch CSI and record the number of errors per episode, you know.
Well, Linda Fairstein once told us that she would get so upset because she'd be trying a trial on something that happened in New York, and the jury had already seen it on Law and Order, and they're saying, well, that's not how it happened.
So television has had, in fact, a significant negative impact on juries and on prosecutors and prosecuting crime, because there's now this sense that there ought to be DNA everywhere, and and that you can get DNA results back. Massachusetts Crime Lab, well, we've heard about the crime lab, but in addition to that, they were so backed up that they had a sort of a 2 crimes per month per county rule, and that was, you could have your homicides plus 2 other crimes, and everything else, if you could afford a private lab, you could get it tested. But the situation in crime labs nationally is just appalling. I was listening to people from the Washington State Crime Lab talking last week, and the guy said that they needed another, I think it was a document examiner, that they had been trying for 2 years to hire somebody. There were 2 different positions that they were trying to fill, and they can't hire anybody. There aren't the trained people, and they can't, if the states can't afford the salaries that private industry can. So the private labs can snap up the people that the state labs have spent 5 to 8 years training. And so there's, that's another problem. It takes a long time to learn to be a good fingerprint examiner. It's not like you go to school and walk in and on day 1 you can see the matches and you can, know how to work with the prints and all that stuff. So that we actually have something of a national crisis, except on television.
Yeah, except in Vegas.
Right. Another question? I don't know. No? There isn't anything you're just dying to know? I mean, I always think this is so much this kind of show and tell kind of thing.
How many of you are writers? Are you all readers?
Readers? Oh, we love. We just love them. What could be more fun?
But something did occur to me. You said that readers are expecting a murder, pretty much expecting a murder, because that's why they're called murder mysteries.
Right.
Do you think it would be off-putting to too many readers if there was no murder? Or, I mean, there's usually a whodunit, but could you write a did it happen? Right?
Well, there've been
where the
some
crime
of those.
is ambiguous whether a crime occurred.
There's a fair number of those. I mean, I think many of us approached my third or fourth book, I guess, was it a suicide, an accident, or a homicide? And that, was sort of the fundamental question that the book was addressing until you got to the point where it was fairly clear that there was too much going on for it to have been an accident. So, and I think we all start, with that question of ambiguity, because there often is ambiguity. That's a nice question. I like that question.
I was going to ask what the strangest question you've ever had is.
Well, what's the strangest question you've ever had, Ruth?
I don't think I really had.
You don't got to it?
No, because I'm very new at this.
Yeah,
You
I guess
probably-
there are all kinds of questions, but I think one of the most amusing questions I think I ever had was I had written one book where I said I gave Thea this life where she had, a difficult brother and a demanding mother who wasn't ever satisfied by anything that she did and so forth. And there's finally a book in which she explodes at her mother. She just sort of says, I've had it, you don't see me, you don't recognize me, I don't, there's just this huge blow up, and she walks out. And somebody came up to me when I was giving a talk about that book, and they said, excuse me, may I ask you a personal question? And I said, you may ask, because you never know whether you're going to want to answer the question, but let's hear it first. And she said, is Thea's mother your mother? And I said, no, my mother was the most extraordinary, exemplary mother for a writer that a person could ever have. And so then, that wasn't enough. She said, okay, so where did she come from? And then obviously the answer is your imagination, but where do characters come from? Do Do we just make them up? Do we base them on real people? My characters always feel like they exist. They always feel as though they're somebody that I'm meeting in the course of writing the book. But obviously they're composites. You know, you take different traits. The only time I've ever used a real person in a book was this, and I guess probably shouldn't say this, should I? I had this boss at BU when I was teaching legal writing and research who was just the meanest, nastiest guy. And so I put him in the book knowing that he'd never recognize himself and then did dreadful things to him. And that was very therapeutic. But for the most part,
One thing I should say though is my husband always says the characters are not based on him because there's a lot of domestic violence. He makes sure he tells everyone.
oh, there is. I mean, there are those kinds of questions. And then, of course, everybody who reads the book does assume, I think, that the characters are us. And well, actually, another really interesting question I was asked once was the police officer down in Newark, Delaware, who gave me the information that sort of created my Joe Burgess character, who told me that story. Emailed me once and said, which of the characters in your book is you? And I emailed him back and I said, okay, I said, I'm just a writer, you're the detective, you tell me. So he wrote back and he said, all of them. And I said, that's absolutely right. I mean, what we do when we're going to create a character is, you know, for the good guys, you might draw on who you want to be, and for the bad guys, you might draw on your worst impulses, you know, how you feel when you're angry, or, you know, if you want to know how to write powerful emotion or powerful reaction, a person who is not violent responding with violence, imagine how you would react if somebody threatened one of your children, you know, and you can just take that feeling and go with it and then create the character.
Kate, do you find sometimes that your characters grow where you didn't expect them to grow as you're writing your book?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I think one of the most interesting...
I mean, you think you know them and they go off here and you were planning to go here?
Oh, yeah. Characters run away with books all the time. They're very willful. I think one of the things that's most interesting in a way is when a character does something that you haven't planned and you're writing along and you're sitting there, and of course this is coming out of your own head, and all of a sudden something coming out of your head flowing through your fingers onto the paper is something you didn't plan. It's not something you imagined. It's not something that you knew you imagined. It's not something you meant for your character to do, and they do it. And you're suddenly stopped and you say, what's this about? In the beginning, it was terrifying. In the beginning, I thought that it was so scary when your characters misbehave. Now I know that if a character misbehaves, it's purposeful and it will take the book in the right direction. But you often, as a writer, find yourself playing catch-up with your characters who've gone off and done something or said something. Have you ever had that happen?
I have.
Was that your subconscious speaking?
Yeah, I assume so. I mean, just like, yeah, I mean, there's a lot to this. I mean, really, you know, people always say, what's the best preparation for becoming a writer? And you say reading. And you realize that your head is full of decades of story and character in real life and on TV and in the movies and in your reading. And there's an awful lot of stuff there to work with. It's like, why, we don't plan our dreams. And yet sometimes dreams are so amazingly vivid, you wake up in the morning and you say, how could I have imagined that complete with pictures? But it's all there.
And I'm glad it's not real.
And I'm glad it's not real. Right, exactly. But, and sometimes the characters, whole stories will just take turns that I didn't expect. The other thing that's really weird, and I don't know if this has happened to you yet, Ruth, because you haven't done a series character for so long, but the idea that I've done 7 Thea books now, and I'm plotting the 8th. So I've been living with her for a lot of years. And there'll be these moments where, someone will say something at a dinner party, and I once leaned across the table and I said, that's exactly what Thea thinks. Wait a minute, Thea doesn't exist. Thea's not real. But that was the reaction that I
Kind of
had.
like Harvey, isn't it?
Yeah, it can be a little spooky.
No, that hasn't happened yet, but I hope it will in my series.
I actually think, in Playing God, this is spooky story number 1, the spookiest thing that ever happened to me as a writer. There's a point in Playing God in which Joe Burgess is on his investigation, and he's going to talk to former patients of the dead doctor, and to people who wrote letters complaining about the doctor. And so he goes into a building, and he goes to a house somewhere on the coast of Maine, and he knocks on the door, And the woman opens the door, and he's in this little dark hallway, and she takes him down the staircase and opens the door, and they're suddenly in this 2-story room, which is all glass, looking out at the water, and it's her quilting room. And she has 2 quilting tables. She has quilts hung from the balconies. She has bolts and bolts and bolts of cloth and cutting tables and sewing machines and all of this and so forth. Well, a year later, I'm looking for a house on the coast of Maine, and I walk in the front door and go down a hall and through a door, and I am standing in that room. And I made it up.
Wow.
And I thought, oh my gosh,
Premonition.
I better be really, really careful about what I make up.
What about the house?
No, we didn't. I couldn't. I had to leave.
That's
I
it.
had to leave.
Yeah.
I had to walk right out. I had to go stand in the yard. I couldn't breathe.
Wow.
No, it was just so eerie. But that doesn't fortunately happen very often.
That's a
You
good
start-
story right there, though.
Well,
When you start dreaming lottery numbers, give me a call.
yeah, exactly. So far, that's right. All right for you.
Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, and thank all of you for coming too.